Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iranga Kahangama. I'm very excited to be here with you today. I want to start just by thanking the Republic of Estonia's Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication, the Estonian Space Office, as well as the Enterprise and Estonia for collectively organizing this conference. I do want to apologize for not being able to be there in person. I was very much excited to make it to Estonia. But as these things go, the work got a number of meetings and work events prevented me from doing so, but I do enjoy the opportunity to join you in future events. And I hope everyone is having a good time in Tallinn. So, as I said, my name is Iranga Kahangama. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Cyber Infrastructure Risk and Resilience at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. I love and I hate my title. It's quite long. It's very hard to put on a business card. But at the same time, I think it's really indicative of the nature of the work that we do and how it may relate even to things that you all may be interested in, including space cybersecurity, in that we look at cybersecurity holistically from an infrastructure perspective as well as a risk and resilience perspective. And so I like to really blend a lot of those concepts together when I talk about my job. So I think very much the types of conferences and space cybersecurity issues you all are aware of are very critical issues. So I want to talk to you a little bit about space cybersecurity, how my department and my government is viewing it, and some of the roles we play that may not be as traditional as other space or cybersecurity agencies around the world. When you think about the US and space, not necessarily think about the Department of Homeland Security. And I think that's fair. You may think about NASA or the Defense Department's new Space Force. And, realistically, when you look at the landscape of space and the space security community, it's sprawling. Many of our US government partners have been working on space issues for decades, and we haven't even realized it. I'm in month 5 of my role, coming over from the National Security Council at the White House. From my former days at the NSC, I saw some things through the National Space Council, which is chaired by our Vice President through the White House. But even more deeply, when I've come to the Department of Homeland Security, I've seen how some of these space issues are worked with a rigor that I did not realize before. At DHS, we're concerned about space cybersecurity from a number of fronts, but we also think that the expansion brings significant economic opportunities, innovation at a very impressive pace. And so our goal is to stay relevant with the commercialization of space and some of those private and public sector actors. So internally at DHS, we've been looking for ways to partner better with all of these stakeholders. Obviously, with our role, whether that's with CISA or TSA or other security agencies, we are cybersecurity is at the forefront of our minds. And space is really another avenue for us to apply a lot of those same principles. We've created partnerships with small and large space companies, and we've worked with industry at roundtable events in the US. We've worked with academia and research organizations as well in the science and technology space. And we've brought up the space cybersecurity issue with partners, whether that's multilateral organizations or other governments across the world, be it in Europe or otherwise. So, we make sure that our cybersecurity equities are covered with a lot of these companies, a lot of these countries. We want to make sure that people are doing things like protecting their intellectual property from illicit theft, so that, as the commercial space sector thrives and the value of space-based data increases, we want to make sure that those economic opportunities can be born, right? That if we're making available space-based data for travel or for communications or for new data applications, that's protected, and that people who are benefiting from the commercialization of space are also protecting themselves and the innovation that they are creating. And I think we say that from the context that the threat can be very real. We all saw what happened with Russia's attack on the Viasat satellite system and how it had subsequent effects throughout Europe, and how these malicious cyber activities prove that space-based targets are very much a threat, at threat. So it's unfortunate that we have to state that that different actors have different visions for what should be done and not be done in cyberspace, including disruptive and malicious activity. But I think we're truly at an inflection point with our commercial space industry worldwide, and that's one of the messages that I want you to take away. It's no longer sufficient for those involved in the commercial space industry to talk about how important cybersecurity is. We now need to use partnership and partner with governments and the commercial industry to really maximize approaches to cybersecurity. We have lots of best practices, we have lots of frameworks, but frankly, even as a US government, perhaps not in space yet, but as a general cybersecurity principle, we are trying to move from beyond partnership and move from just partnering to doing side-by-side activities, right? We have the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. They do this thing called the JCDC, in case you guys have paid attention to that. It's the Joint Cyber Collaborative, Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Sorry, it is 6:15 in the morning here in the US. But what JCDC is a really good example of, it's not just sharing information back and forth with agencies. It's literally, and companies. It's companies and the government sitting side by side, looking at cyber attacks together in real time and doing that information sharing and triaging live. So I think that's a really interesting public-private partnership to move into the space cybersecurity world. But with that, I think there's a couple of big pillar items that I'm looking to hit in the next few minutes. First, I'd like to talk about what our department, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, is going to be doing and how we view space cybersecurity and how we've tried to use our pedestal to drive some security things forward in the space community. Then I'd like to very briefly speak about the importance of protecting the intellectual property in space and space-based assets, as I mentioned before. And then finally, I just want to briefly discuss the US's pledge to no longer engage in kinetic direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing. And that's something that we've taken to the United Nations General Assembly as part of that norm building experience. So with that, in December 2021, the United States National Space Council formally approved the Biden administration's Space Priorities Framework. During that meeting, my secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, announced that DHS was working to update its own policy on space and that we would reflect the administration's priorities and align the department with that framework. So from a policy perspective, a very clean process to get that done. So indeed, several months later, the secretary signed a new DHS space policy articulating what our priorities would be within the realm of our mission related to American space activities. And I think I categorize it as two-pronged. We're going to be looking at improving space cybersecurity before a launch and after a launch. We call it left of launch and right of launch. It's available on dhs.gov. I encourage you all to check it out. But as a broad summary, I think before a launch, we're really going to focus on supply chain cybersecurity and making commercial entities that are working in space and have space-based assets, payloads that we placed on orbit, have properly thought about protection against space supply chain cybersecurity. And what that means is that we've obviously seen the damage that can be caused by a supply chain attack. We've seen that once you embed something deep within a network or within a system, it can have significant downstream consequences. The unique part about space is that if a space asset is subject to those supply chain attacks and then placed on orbit, it's potentially much more difficult, maybe impossible, or significantly expensive to attempt to fix that asset. A cybersecurity supply chain attack means that equipment cannot be easily replaced. And so we face a lot of consequences or have a lot of unknowns in this space. And so we're working to really educate with the space cyber community to make sure that they are resilient against those types of attacks. After a launch, or right of launch, we're going to be working with our government, our critical infrastructure partners, and private sector partners to make sure that there is resilience in the use of our space data. Once these assets go up, they're there for a purpose. And increasingly through the commercialization of space, that means their data. And that resilience means the ability to continue to use and access and leverage that data for whatever purpose you may be doing. So we want to make sure that from a resilience perspective, if those critical infrastructure owners and operators are using space data for critical navigation, perhaps our critical assets are providing key services to affected and vulnerable members of our country. Perhaps in a conflict situation, there may be dependencies there. There's any number of uses of this data that not just affect the daily lives of Americans or global citizens, but could be directly relevant to the national security priorities of the United States. And so we want to make sure that we are making those capabilities resilient to cyber attacks. So I think, in 2020, through the National Space Policy, we recognize that space is a contested military domain. And I think we have a significant interest in making sure that having plans for possible impacts to the homeland based on future conflict in the space domain is something that we are keenly aware of. And I think this space policy that we've signed out is indicative of our prioritizing that. So put simply, we want to help ensure that cybersecurity measures are included in space components by design before they're getting attacked to prevent those supply chain attacks, and then that these components continue to function on orbit and have relatively easy access to the data and services that they provide. So that's how we're thinking about our policy. To quickly talk a little bit about the protection of intellectual property, I want to emphasize that this is a very significant point for not just for me, but for our department. Our department's Homeland Security Investigations actually runs the Intellectual Property Rights Center in the United States, and we can provide specific expertise to organizations about how to create plans to protect your intellectual property. Now, I will admit that, the genesis of our IP Rights Center was not based on space. That's a new foray for that organization, but I think the same principles apply, right? Cyberspace is another domain that enterprising commercial actors are participating in with significant unique intellectual property, but it's still a domain that's being used by cyber criminals and nation state actors who seek to steal intellectual property that you're creating every day. This illegal activity is underway constantly, and the growth of the space industry makes it a prime target. And it's a more novel industry. While they've worked in space for a long time, I think the global interconnected nature of the industry means it's at threat. And the theft of that data not only hurts the ability for companies and organizations to continue to provide services and have economic benefits, but there are downstream effects. And to what I've meant earlier, that is to the homeland, to our national security and our economic security. So we want to continue to be able to rely upon those critical services. And I think as companies, they want to continue to grow and innovate, and we want to stimulate that growth in a secure manner. So our intellectual property center has done a lot of work with the technology sector, and we're looking to expand that to partnerships with space companies and space-based operators. So, I think just like a supply chain attack, this requires a constant vigilance as threat actors are becoming more and more uniquely positioned, more and more novel in their techniques and their uses to steal intellectual property. And then the downstream long-term impacts should threat actors take that intellectual property, perhaps beat someone to market, or more maliciously sell that off to competitors for profit. Those are all going to ultimately harm the companies that are trying to work on these really innovative solutions. So, I think we are actively engaged in looking at how to build in measures to help create a robust innovation system, but to protect that intellectual property. And so today, for those listening, that's a direct ask to think about what potential intellectual property threats you're facing in the global cybersecurity space within space. So finally, I want to highlight a little bit about testing norms, where the U.S. government has had some movement. In April of this year, Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the chair of our National Space Council, announced the U.S. would no longer engage in destructive direct descent anti-satellite missile testing. We're very proud of this pledge because it mitigates the potential for harmful space debris and it reduces the potential for kinetic events in space. The protection of safe orbit space is critical for ensuring the sustainability of our economy for companies worldwide. The US has taken the first step towards mitigating the use of kinetic weapons in space while recognizing that there is a lot more to be done. We're very excited when our State Department announced in September that it was going to be introducing this very same direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing norm to the United Nations as a proposed binding resolution. As I mentioned earlier, not all nations of the world see the free use of space as beneficial, and some seek to use it as a potential warfighting domain. So this norm is extremely important for us to hold nations accountable for their behavior in space and ensure escalatory actions do not proceed unchecked. The process of creating a binding resolution will take time, obviously, but I think this is a cause that is worthy of attention now, and I wanted to highlight it to all of you here today. While the respective delegation at the UN will continue to work out what the precise language looks like, it is also important for the space industry to understand the value of what's being created by this norm and helping create a movement for this at the United Nations. I think this is a really important first step to create normalized behavior in space in this new era. As I said, I feel like we're at an inflection point in space. I said before, admittedly, I'm very new to the department and new to the space world, but I've been in cybersecurity for many years, and I've been parts of US government and global conversations about using the UN and other bodies to create norms of acceptable behavior in cyberspace writ large. And I think this is a natural evolution into that space. So it's up to governments to define what those norms are, just like we have traditionally in cybersecurity. And I'd like to highlight that the US would want to play a leading role in this area, and we are attempting to do that very much so with this binding agreement proposal. So I'm sure for most people in the room, there's already a belief that cybersecurity is important for space assets, but I think this norm really expands to stakeholders who may otherwise not be thinking with that same mindset. I'm here today to call on us to drive together and use our energy in creating new and exciting approaches to cybersecurity in the space domain, and that the UN avenue is another one of those methods for driving those norms. Be happy to offer the expertise and assistance of my staff to work with international partners, be they other governments or companies, to help think through unique and original solutions to mitigate these types of problems. So with that, I'd really like to come to my conclusion and believe this audience should just be fully aware of some of the things that I've mentioned. So I think the threat to cybersecurity for space assets is not a theoretical one. We've seen it occurring. The threat from Russia and other nations that do not share our values, it's not a theoretical one. It's very much a real one. And I don't think I need to say more for a country like Estonia, who very much faces that threat quite literally in their backyard. Estonians and Europeans, including those in Ukraine, know very well what happens when Russian cyber attacks are occurring across borders and have experienced one directly on satellites. We'll continue to stand with our allies against such aggressive actions. Specific to space, we have the opportunity to build an ecosystem amongst us that is both economically vibrant and an unattractive target to would-be cyber criminals and cyber attackers. But this only happens ultimately if we work together and if we take our shared knowledge of the importance of these issues and translate them into usable tools for those creating the most innovative and exciting assets in space. So I'd like to create something together, something that will build a vibrant and secure economy and generate opportunities for generations to come. I look forward to partnering with you all and driving cybersecurity throughout the space community. With that, I want to thank everyone for allowing me to speak. I hope I was understandable at this early hour, but it was a pleasure to do it. I did have my coffee this morning. I look forward to being in touch with you all and stand ready to collaborate with you and my office. Thank you. And I look forward to having a conversation about these topics. Thanks.
So definitely also a massive thank you to you for waking up so early to participate here and to deliver your keynote. Like I said before, now it's time for the questions. So I would very much appreciate it if you would use the chance to also ask your own questions. And we already have the first hand up and microphone as well. So Marili, you can ask your question now.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Iranga. I myself, I haven't been ever in the States, but I'm very curious, what is the feeling of the community, of the cybersecurity community there? And how do you create and sustain the community feeling? That would be the one part of the question. And the other one is, how much aware, in your opinion, is the population in the States, and whether cybersecurity and space cybersecurity is something that needs to be demystified?
Thanks. I think both those are very good questions. I think to the first one, there is an awareness, and I think the benefit of this space and cyber community nexus is that it's very small, even in the United States. But I think that creates a really nice, intimate community where there can be a lot of momentum. A member of my staff, Nick Reese, who's been intimately involved in a lot of the planning of our space activities, attends a number of space cyber symposiums. We actually held one jointly with the Department of Commerce, because the Commerce Department owns a lot of the private sector relationships in our country. And then they also have, the science and research community through a number of their national standards organizations and other research organizations. But perhaps, I'm biased in that a lot of the space activities are American companies, so we do have a physical presence in the US. But I think as a government, and specifically as a Department of Homeland Security, we've tried to create those opportunities. And I think that's really the key. In a slightly post-COVID environment, we're trying to have a little bit more in person. But we have, we've held a couple of space cyber symposiums in the US, and I'm happy to send the organizers a little bit more information of what that looks like. But I delivered slightly similar remarks at those just a few months ago. And I think it was really positively received by the research community and then industry. I think industry has long been seeking government assistance and government support in other sectors. And I think as a US government, we have generally built communities around our critical infrastructure sectors. And I think a realization that the space sector is a little bit of a gap was part of the reason to build that up. So I would say it's a small community, but I think that still has some positive benefits in that there's some big players who have outsized voices. And so we feel that those are really key stakeholders that we can engage to kind of grow awareness and partnership in these early stages, right? It's kind of like a startup in that sense, where if you're entering a market that's already massively expanded, not to say space is small, but I think there's key actors and key nodes that we are continuing to gauge who have a pretty big impact. And then on the second one, I think we're quite a far away, and I think space cybersecurity needs to be demystified. Frankly, cybersecurity writ large still needs to be demystified, at least amongst our population and our public. I think as a general matter, the Biden-Harris administration has done a really good job of trying to make more understandable and more in your face cybersecurity, right? I think the measure for me, I've worked in this field for many years in government. My parents are Sri Lankan immigrants who came to America in the 1970s, do not really understand what I do, but within the last year or two would see CNN and news about ransomware attacks. And then she's better understanding what cybersecurity is and what she needs to do. And I find that that's my measure of success of targeting the American public, because she now better understands what I do. But I think a series of events early in the Biden administration, like Colonial Pipeline and attacks on food industries and attacks on very upfront organizations that, and I put, Viasat as part of that. I think Viasat is one of the biggest cyber incidents that we've seen publicly come out of the Ukraine conflict. And that as these become more, the Biden-Harris administration definitely understands the need to educate the public around these incidents and grow cybersecurity. So I think you've seen a lot of that in the messaging from our cybersecurity infrastructure security agency, but there's still a lot more work to be done in that space.
Thank you very much. Any other hands up here in the room? Yes, there's plenty already, so we're going to get to the next question.
Yes, so hi, good morning. I have a question regarding what do you see from your point of view, from your experience, your position, what are the biggest vulnerabilities in space asset management, space programs, and so on? Is it more on the technological side, or the lack of technology, or on the utilization of technology, or it's more on the policy and regulation side?
Thanks. That's a really good question. I think a lot of the conversations that we've had, it's not for a lack of use of the technology. I think it's the policies. I think the interesting part of a lot of kind of space companies that we've used is that there's a little bit more of an overlap in the company and the types of work, types of systems they're using, and the types of work that they're doing that inherently uses technology. More so than other sectors, right? I think I've worked with other sectors like healthcare, which is playing a lot of catch up in actually deploying the use of technology, and as a result, potentially incorrectly or insecurely deploying that technology. I see that less with the space industry, but I do see it as like more of a policy and governance type of situation, right? I think the rush to market is a general principle that is, it's I don't want to say a space race, because I think that's kind of a funny term in a lot of ways, but there is a bit of a race to innovate and be a kind of a first mover in space, because it's a relatively more nascent field. And I think in the run up to that, when you're thinking about deploying space assets with, a really cool and significant end goal, sometimes cybersecurity can be an afterthought in terms of how you're doing that. And I think there's also a need to kind of better discern what's happening, after you deploy something to space versus your systems on the ground, what that connectivity looks like, and thinking through your assets kind of full circle journey, right, from production to deployment, and to return, and what that longevity looks like. I think I mentioned the healthcare, sector. I think there's some interesting corollaries there where we like hospitals are being ransomware significantly, and we really try to ask for software patches and updates to really critical operational technology systems, whether that's an MRI machine or other kind of big ticket asset item in a hospital that's vulnerable to cybersecurity. And oftentimes when we go in and talk to them, companies say, well, this was deployed in 1990 and it has a 45-year life cycle. And it's $100,000 piece of equipment, and, the ability to like update it from a previous, connected system is quite expensive. So it's kind of, and I don't blame, a hospital in 1990 that's buying a huge, slightly connected piece of equipment for not thinking through these issues. That wasn't a thing at the time. But I think now when we are deploying, we have a little bit more awareness of what that looks like. And so thinking through the governance process of ensuring that being a connected item properly secured, and what the policies and procedures need to be, not just for securing it, but for mitigating it, in the event that it is happening, so that we have backups and resilience, even if they are attacked. And thinking through that life cycle is something that I think is unique in a complicated industry like space. So I think it's really that latter part of how you build policy, how you govern it in that kind of unique environment.
Thanks. Hands up that I saw before. Any questions still from the audience? You still have the chance to ask. We have around 10 minutes for the questions. So anybody still has something in mind that... Okay, so there is one hand up again. And there we go.
Hello, hi, good morning. Thank you for being here actually so early for having this discussion. You mentioned the DHS as one of the pillar of interest is in protecting the supply chain. Let's say today we're talking about space applications. So allow me to be a little bit provocative. So a few years ago, we came to know that an unnamed governmental agency has been, planting devices on, let's say, unnamed network provider. And so for many years, this agency was able to intercept communication around the world. So this is one example of how you can attack a supply chain, And so today, how do you see in practice, because you mentioned it's very crucial for the DHS, again, to protect the supply chain. How do you say this happening? So aside of, combination maybe of technology and policy, but is there any indication more from the practical point of view for the industry? So I just have a company, so I'm interested on practicalities. How do you see this happening? How do you see happening this ensuring and protecting the supply chain, specifically for space applications?
Thanks for the question. I think, some general principles do apply, right? And I think from the US perspective, on the cyber defensive side where I work, we promote very specific principles around, specifically around secure by design. And I think that involves a number of things that we can do to be more visible with a number of our downstream assets, right? Whether that's applying principles like zero trust or software bill of materials to increase transparency. I think the supply chain issue needs to be both prevented and easily mitigated, right? And I think zero trust and SBOM are two concepts that help prevent the spread of those types of things and allow us to better understand what those look like. I think working with multiple stakeholders, so I think the interesting part of our ability to get at supply chain issues is convening things like vendors and the developers of software who run across industries where we have the most scalable impacts, right? So that typically involves the telecommunications companies, software companies that are providing cross-sector technology solutions and ensuring that those are secure by design. As a US government, we are attempting to lead on that aspect. We recently, in 2021, we had an executive order signed by President Biden, and there's a section in there all around software security, software supply chain security. I encourage you all to read it. I think it's a very aggressive effort by the US government to try to drive software security throughout the supply chain. It mandates that the US government, that software vendors to the US government will need to attest that their security of their software and provide things like a software bill of materials to the government to increase transparency and reduce the malicious impact of a supply chain attack. And I think all of those principles are applicable to the space industry and space assets. I think, we're not really reinventing the wheel here. We are trying to apply tried and true principles and processes to another industry, an industry that is burgeoning and is on one hand unique in the critical assets and the critical services and the way they provide them, but at the same time not so unique and just another sector that is going to face the same types of threats, right? It's, I think, comparable to the fact that I think a lot of space cybersecurity companies are going to be vulnerable to very simple cyber attacks like phishing and password spraying and things like that. So I think, I think all of that plays into a very specific plan to prevent cybersecurity attacks throughout in a supply chain manner. But I think the point that I'd like to emphasize is that you need, as a space company, you need to think through what that plan looks like, what that plan is, right? What that plan looks like to say that your products and your services are potentially secure by design. If they're not, understanding what they look like and how to mitigate those quickly and effectively, and to have a plan for not allowing unforeseen supply chain attacks from propagating significantly throughout your product's life cycle. So I think there's lots of lessons to be learned more broadly that aren't so unique to the space sector, but definitely relevant to it. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, there is a hand up again by Marilei. Here we go.
A question about complexity. We know that whenever the system is a bit more, even a tiny bit more complex, then this raises the costs by 1.3 times. So it has been calculated that with the pace that the technology is advancing currently, we will be out of money in a decade or so. So from your government side, are you implemented some kind of processes or creating some kind of initiatives to reduce or to find ways how to reduce complexity?
I mean, I think cost is always a really big barrier to cybersecurity. I think that's a really interesting question. I think from the US government side, we are reducing complexity by trying to provide guidance and resources where we can. I think DHS providing its own cybersecurity policy was our initial way of showing that we are a partner, and that we have very explicitly said that we are in the process using our science and technology experts, our intelligence experts, our cybersecurity experts to provide more resources to better understand that. I think we're also trying to lead in terms of innovative solutions through our research communities to provide public-private partnerships that I mentioned before, where we can sit closer side by side with companies. I think this kind of principle is also applicable for a lot of the work that our government has done on quantum computing and quantum and post-quantum encryption security type efforts. I think we've done a lot of really good partnerships to demystify and better educate companies about what those types of security threats look like. Obviously, we don't have unlimited funding. I know our president is very focused on critical infrastructure and deploying security to infrastructure through a number of bills and budgets that we've passed. I think there are some potential grant-making opportunities where you could maybe leverage, securing infrastructure and cybersecurity is very much part of that infrastructure conversation in our country. We're trying to build in cybersecurity into all critical infrastructure proposals and deployments of money that we're doing across our country. I don't know if space is quite there yet in terms of a critical infrastructure sector for us to be able to do that. But I do think through the provision of intelligence, products, information, you're going to be seeing some resources in the coming months and years coming from our government as we've identified this as a priority for us. And frankly, that's something the U.S. Department of Homeland Security is looking to do. We're looking to partner to better understand what your complexities are and see where we can help with that. My office in particular has been working on a broad range of emerging technologies as part of a program in our office, and we've tried to do that. We've tried to demystify and better help understand the complexities around the cybersecurity in specific ways. We've recently embarked upon a project partnering with several universities to better understand and communicate the risk of Internet of Things and connected communities to key stakeholders in state, local, cities and towns across the U.S. as they make purchases to secure their cities in a safe way, that they understand the cyber risks. It's a much smaller example, obviously, and not as complex as some of these space systems. But I think the concept remains that I think the government we're going to be looking to ramp up our ability to educate and partner with you all. But I would throw that question back on you and ask, as you all work in the industry, to help us understand where those complexities exist and where we can help you as well.
All right, we can take one more last question from the audience before we wrap it up here. Any hands up here? No questions from the audience. So I maybe use my own chance as well here, if there is no hands up here. We've been talking about here a lot about raising awareness, but also when it comes to the cyber security, it's very clear that we are also facing a massive problem with the skills gap of cyber professionals. Maybe you can just talk about very briefly what your work is doing in order to tackle that issue as well, because I think it's a problem also widely in US.
No, I agree. And I mean, I would say not just in the US, globally, obviously a huge skills and workforce shortage, and one not just unique to the space industry, right? I think every industry has a shortage of employees and workers. I think what we've tried to do within the department to increase, we've tried to take innovative approaches to be more competitive with the private sector. We've tried to, create some pay incentives and training incentives to work with government, to work and bring on more talented people. But I also think we've tried to tap into more diverse communities and sectors. That includes looking at non-traditional workforces. I don't think you need to have a traditional degree, or maybe you don't even need a degree at all to do some of these programs. Some people have been in industry for many months and years without those types of qualifications. So I think we need in the government to break down a lot of those barriers and expectations in order to have a more diverse and more skilled workforce. And we're also looking at some training programs, working through a couple of educational university programs to bring on people within the government, but that's definitely a shortage that we have too within the government. All
right. Thank you very much, as we are now running out of the time as well, so no more questions anymore. I'm happy to say to you that have a lovely day, first of all. Enjoy your second coffee. You really deserve this by waking up so early for us. So have a lovely day there, and we will continue now with our 8th panel already. But round of applause, of course, as well for you.